Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Danielle Dyer. I'm a librarian here at the Venice Branch Library, and we're so excited to bring you this discussion of Joseph Hansen today. First, I wanted to let you know about a couple of things happening in our branch. Each week on Wednesday at 12 noon, we offer yoga as on Zoom, and on Fridays at 11 a.m. we're offering Pilates. They are both on Zoom, and we want to thank our friends of the Venice Library for funding these wonderful programs for us. In addition, we have a nonfiction book club the last Tuesday of each month, and a mystery book club. Sorry, a mystery book club the second Thursday of the month. So the fiction nonfiction is the last Tuesday of the month, and the mystery book club is the second Tuesday of the month. If you want more information about these programs and other things that we offer here at the Venice Library, you can find us at lapl.org/Venice or on Instagram at Venice LAPL. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, John.
You're muted.
All right, John Frank. I am the senior librarian excuse me, I'm having a little mic problem, but John Frank, senior librarian at the Venice Branch Library. Very excited to finally be able to do this program. I've been wanting to do this for a while. Joseph Hansen, I met through the UCLA extension, and I will talk about that in a second. But first, we have a very distinguished panel. Bill Mohr, professor in English at Cal State Long Beach. He is the author of Holdouts, the Los Angeles Poetry Renaissance. He is the editor and publisher at Momentum Press and has written several volumes of poetry. Momentum Press did produce some Joe Hansen works. Our other guest that I'm very happy to have is Michael Nava, just a fantastic novelist. He's an attorney, worked with the California Supreme Court. He has written a 10-volume Henry Rios series, and he is an openly gay protagonist, kind of procedurals in a lot of ways, but they're really great books. He's received 7 Lambda Literary Awards. What I'd like to start by talking about is my experiences with Joe, who I met through the UCLA extension. Basically looked in the catalog, was interested in the genre, did not know who Joe was. And it was an open enrollment. And after reading one of his books, I was really stunned that, someone on that level would be doing an open enrollment class. So needless to say, I spent a couple years studying with him, and just a superb teacher. He really raised the bar for writing workshops and people's dedication. He had 30 people in that class. And what would happen is that we would submit work. I think 10 pages was the ceiling. And you would get back from him line edits on your entire piece, like a professional would do it. I had to go get a book to figure out what the symbols were. And then he would give you like 1-2 pages of notes, single spaced, just brilliant stuff. And he had 30 people in that class. I'm not quite sure how he pulled that off, but Joe was always just an example of what you'd want to be when you grow up. He was a great, strong speaker, writer. He really showed a lot of us who didn't have experience in this what a professional writer. He really articulated how a professional writer thinks, what a professional writer does. And it was an experience that I'll never forget. And any writing that I've done since then, or any writing classes, he's the fountainhead. What I'd like to do now is bring in my other panel members, and talk a little bit about Joe as a writer.
Well, Michael, I thought you were going to be leading it off since you're the prose writer. You are the working writer in the model of Joe. Whereas I'm more of a literary critic and poet. So why don't you lead off, Michael?
Sure. So I encountered Joe through his work when I was in law school in the late 70s, early 80s, and I had actually started out. So I've been writing since I was 12, and I'd started out as a poet, which coincidentally was also what Joe started out with. I think his first published work was a poem in the Atlantic when he was a very young man. And over the decades, he wrote constantly. I mean, he really was a dedicated writer. And there were many, many lean years when he couldn't get published by any of the important houses, and his work was published by some very smaller independent presses. In the 60s, he wrote a series of books, I think under the pseudonym James Colton, which were published by, I suppose, what would now be considered a gay press. I think the difficulty he encountered in getting published was that Joe was openly and unapologetically gay, a word he hated, by the way. He preferred homosexual. So Joe was homosexual at a time when, there were sodomy laws in 49 of the 50 states, and people were either considered criminal, mentally ill, or morally defective. It was tremendously courageous for him to be open at that time. And he was also involved in the early homophile movement, which was the precursor to the mass gay movement that came about after Stonewall. And that injured him as a writer in attempting to get published. And I think he turned to mysteries. I don't think he set out to be a mystery writer, but he turned to mysteries. And it was there that he found commercial and critical success with the publication in 1970 of Fade Out, which was the first of the 12 Brandstetter books, which has recently been republished by Soho Syndicate, which is republishing all of them. And I was so honored when they asked me to write the introduction to Fade Out. In the 70s, there was a small renaissance of gay writing, but it was mostly coming out of New York, and it mostly involved a very small set of the gay world, which was involved with, frankly, drugs and sex. That was kind of what was going on there. I was going to be a lawyer, and I didn't identify with those characterizations. And then I started reading Joe's books, and his protagonist, Dave Brandstetter, is a claims investigator for an insurance agent, a death claims investigator for an insurance agency. And he is unapologetically gay, but he's also a competent professional who has to interact daily with the heterosexual world, which is the life that most of us were going to be leading, most of us post-Stonewall, in the post-Stonewall generation. We were going to be in those professions, and we were going to have to interact with the straight world and figure out a way to be true to ourselves, and yet to navigate those two worlds. And Brandstetter was just really an inspiration for me in that sense. So on a very personal level, he gave me a protagonist with whom I could identify, given my own aspirations. And he's also, and I'm sure you'll talk about this more Bill, he's a beautiful writer. His work is his evocation of Southern California in the period in which he was writing, from about the late 60s to the late 90s, is it's unparalleled. I mean, he's as good as Ross MacDonald. He's as good as any of them. And Yeah, I think he's just a fantastic sentence to sentence writer. Um, and he really he he also understood that the classic private investigator in the American war tradition is an outsider who who's called in by respectable society sort of to clean their dirty laundry, but whom they hold in contempt. And I think he understood that that was the position of gay men in the society, that we had an innate sense of our own worthiness and dignity and value that was not recognized by society at large. And so, in a sense, a gay detective is really the perfect protagonist of this outsider tradition in war. He is the perfect successor to Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe, and in that sense, Joe was a pioneer not just for LGBTQ writers, but for writers of color and women writers, because what we saw beginning in the late 80s and through the 90s and continuing now are African American writers, Latina writers, Asian American writers writing in the genre, in the mystery genre, and stepping forward to claim their places in that space. So he is a crucial figure, I think, in the development of the contemporary mystery, and a vastly, vastly underrated writer.
Yeah, I first met Joe as a teacher too. I was a young poet, and I'd heard there was a workshop that had started at Beyond Baroque in Venice, and at that point it was on what was then called West Washington Boulevard, but is now Abbot Kinney. It was near the intersection of Venice Boulevard and West Washington / Abbot Kinney, and then of course eventually Beyond Baroque moved to the old Venice City Hall. But Joe had actually founded, along with John Harris, the poetry workshop at Beyond Baroque, and he would show up every Wednesday night and teach for free. I mean, you talk about open enrollment. I mean, this really was open enrollment, and a lot of us have memories of how open it was in terms of those were the days of, if you will, hippies and frankly, people that really couldn't even be classified as dropouts. I mean, they were dropouts from the Dropout Society, right? So anyone could show up to this workshop, and Joe handled it with such aplomb and grace and insight that it was like watching a conductor conduct a symphony. I mean, he just simply knew how to do it. But I think I would like to concentrate right now for the moment on just how gorgeous Joe's prose is, and it's a very subtle gorgeousness. But by chance, I happened, before the show started, I dug up off my bookshelf a magazine that came out of Papa Bach Bookstore that was called Baki Magazine, and there's a long interview by Leland Hickman with Joe, and here's what Joe has to say about the difference between his detective novels and the other novels he wrote, such as A Smile in His Lifetime. Lee says, "You give me the feeling that the detective novels are less important than A Smile in His Lifetime to you." And Joe replies, "In its restrictions, the detective novel is closer to a poem than to a novel. So I welcomed the chance when it finally came to write a long, loosely structured novel. The music of Mozart, Bach, Haydn is wonderful, held tight inside restrictive formats. But so is Mahler's Symphony No. 3 wonderful. And I hope Smile in His Lifetime is, in its modest way, akin to that, as the mystery novels are, in their way, akin, I hope, to Mozart." Now, for some people, they may think, well, that's setting yourself the bar pretty high. But that's the point of what Joe did as a teacher. He modeled for us what it meant to, as I use the phrase, to play for the whole casino. And one of the things that always struck me about Joe's work is how muted he could be in creating his effects. He didn't go for the melodramatic language. It was always very subtle, and it left you shaking after you read it.
Yeah, I was looking at something. So this is like these are among the opening lines of Fade Out. Um, it rained, Hansen writes, not hard but steady and gray and dismal. Shaggy pines loomed through the mist like threats. Sycamores made white twisted gestures above the arroyo. Down the arroyo water pounded, ugly, angry, and deep. That line, shaggy pines loom through the mists like threat. You can really hear the poet there, and
Yeah.
the visuals are, and you can hear the water. The visuals are, you know, the sense, the descriptions are just they bring you, they bring you there, as you say, Bill, in a very understated way. He was not a flashy writer; he was a precise writer,
Hmm.
which I think is what poets do, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you find the word that does a lot of work for you. That's who he was as a writer. Um, when I finally met Joe in the '80s, and you know we'd have lunch occasionally, he was much older than I was, and he treated me in an avuncular manner, I guess you'd say. So I didn't really know him as a peer or as a teacher. I knew him as sort of, you know, this grand old man. Um, and he was uh, he was very charming. I mean, I think that has to be said. And he had great stories, and we'd have lunch a couple of times a month. And I felt like, you know, I was at the feet of the master.
Yeah. Um, the I actually kind of jealous of those of you, like, you know, John, you studied with him at Extension. I know there are a number of people, in fact, who studied with him at Extension. There was a photographer friend of his named Rod Bradley who published a novel called Gunplay that came out of that. And if you look at the dedication to it, you know, it to all the friends whose faith kept this from the dark drawer, especially Joseph Hansen. That's the dedication page. And I know there are a lot of writers that feel that way. People who got, I mean, people didn't really study with Joe. The difference between Joe's class and a lot of other classes is people actually got published out of Joe's classes, right? They didn't merely aspire to be writers. They became writers. And that was true of the poetry workshop too. The number of people who came out of there who had books is kind of extraordinary, and it was all due to his efforts in keeping that workshop going. Which, once again, as I think John pointed out, how did he do all this? I mean, he's trying to make a living as a writer, and there he is showing up every Wednesday to lead people who, some of them didn't really appreciate what they had in front of them, right? And that was just it. Joe didn't hesitate to tell the truth. If a poem wasn't working, he just let the writer know, and if they didn't like it, well, they're welcome not to come back. But usually people did come back because they realized how much his comments had helped. And they toughened up, and they got a lot better, very quickly.
I think another extraordinary thing about Joe was, and I think he talks about this in one of the late novels, is he didn't have a chance to go to college. I think he may have gone to junior college for a year or so, Pasadena City College.
Right.
But he was one of the most well-read men I've ever met. He was a complete autodidact.
Yes.
And he'd read everything worth reading and then some. Often at these lunches, you know, because started out as a poet. I read a lot of poetry, but I didn't read much fiction. Um, and he was always trying to improve my taste. He would give me Chekhov's short stories and he'd go read these, and or he would give me a list of books that I needed to read. And he would talk about them with such, he was a great writer, but he was also a great reader. I mean, books were living things to him. I mean, his engagement as a reader was the kind of engagement every writer hopes for, I think. And he could speak quite eloquently. So I wonder if in these classes he did that. He talked about the books that he loved, encouraged his students to read them. I think you said he had reading lists that
Yeah.
he gave people.
Yeah, John, did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. He was a connoisseur. I've been looking through all my papers, wish it still existed, so I'm kind of digging in my memory. But the number of books to find that he introduced us to, and not just the obvious ones. A lot of international fiction, a lot of women writers. One thing that I always thought interesting with Joe, you talk about a writer or a reader, is he was a visual artist too. So one of the things that he would talk about was knowing if a page, something was right or not by just looking at what it looked like, not reading it, but where's the white space and all of that. As I said, Joe said more than once that The Glass Key he considered the greatest American crime novel. A lot of Hammett. Chandler, I believe Lady in the Lake was what he recommended for us. Murder of Roger Ackroyd. He was all over the place. He was a master of the genre. I remembered him talking about visiting with, I believe, Julian Simons, and who's a very prolific British crime writer. And at one point they were having a discussion, and Joe asked him about one of his books, and he didn't remember writing it. He led us into a lot of his life as a writer when you were in his classes. The one story that I wanted to get told today, Bill, I think you tell it a little better than me, is about when Showtime was interested in the Brandstetter novels.
I remember Joe telling me quite distinctly that he had gotten a call from Showtime and that they were very interested in doing a series of shows featuring a detective named Brandstetter. And they said to him on the phone, there will be a few changes, of course. And the first one is he's not gay. And it was just a click. Joe said, I just took the phone and hung up. And I think that story tells so much of what he was up against. I mean, that mass culture would, with all of its literally capital and cultural capital, would dare to call up somebody and just sort of say it so casually, as if, of course, they were simply almost like maybe asking an actress, by the way, would you dye your hair blonde for this next movie you're going to make? I mean, as if it were just like as simple as that, and that they would have the effrontery, the nauseating effrontery, to do this. I think this sums up the whole context of what Joe was working within, and that's why when I heard him read some of his poems, I was very struck by how, in a certain sense, as a poet, he was almost like a Brandstetter. Some of the poems address being gay, and others you wouldn't have any idea from reading the poem of the sexual orientation of the poet. So it was writing that absolutely was full-bodied, if you will, in terms of the psychological ramifications. It's interesting, by the way, that when you think of the great mystery writers like Ross MacDonald, I'll give you an idea of one thing I remember Joe saying. It was, MacDonald is really good, but his weakness is that he's too Freudian. And I thought that was the way, we talk about being a precise writer, he was also, and that's the way he was a precise reader, right? He admired and knew the strengths of other writers, but he also saw the thing where they were perhaps a little bit vulnerable, where there was kind of a, if only they had resisted the impulse to sort of go all in a certain direction. And certainly Ross MacDonald is really one of the best, but I thought Joe's comment, and he made that just sort of as an aside once at the Beyond Baroque workshop, because he would talk about prose writers too there, even though, and that's partly because MacDonald is pretty poetic in his prose in his own way.
Mm-hmm. Although, I reread The Blue Hammer, MacDonald's last book, and I just think Joe's a more engaging writer, frankly, and part of it is because of the homosexual element, of the gay element. His character has dimensions that MacDonald's protagonist, Lou Archer, is that his name? Doesn't have. And also there's a consciousness. So Joe was not an overtly political writer. He wasn't pushing any particular ideology, but there is definitely a consciousness in his mystery novels, and one of them I think that comes out most clearly is his treatment of women. I mean, in classic noir, women are either the femme fatales or they're wholly purebred. They don't have a lot of dimension, and there is, I think, a strain of misogyny that runs through some of the classical writers writing about women, which is completely absent in Joe's books. His women characters, whether they're admirable or not so admirable, they're written about as full-blooded human beings. There's not a trace of misogyny in his work, which I think is remarkable, actually, and I think has to do with his being gay. I think I should also mention at this point that Joe is married to a woman, and they're Jane, and they were married for 50 years, which is a complex situation we don't need to go into, but she herself was a very strong woman. And, and when he would introduce occasionally there would be Latino characters, African-American characters. And again, I mean, in traditional noir, there are clear traces of racism in the work of those early writers, and that's completely absent from Joe's work. He writes those characters with an objectivity that's absent in a lot of noir when it comes to writing about characters of color. And in that sense, he's quite a modern writer. He's quite a contemporary writer. So those are, sort of distinguishing aspects of his work that may not have been, completely appreciated at the time he was being published. But I think now really are to his credit.
Part of it is at the time of their publishing, I know with the public, is there's always this perception of like it's just for one audience if you're dealing with those themes. And that was in a lot of, in the open enrollment class, is as people would hear him read his work, there were some that just couldn't get on board with that. There were, retired people in that who just wanted to write an Agatha Christie mystery. And there was always that perception. And when you talk about the Showtime thing too, it's like, his fiction really appeals to everyone. Yours too, Michael. It's really broad. You can really identify with it. And, there are a lot of people, especially in the 80s, that wouldn't open their mind to read a book like that.
Yeah, I compare him to his contemporary Tony Hillerman. And Hillerman's a good writer. I enjoyed his books, although I don't think now it might be more controversial for a white writer to be writing a novel with indigenous people as the protagonist. But putting that aside, Hillerman was a good writer. I think Joe's a better writer. But you look at where their careers went. I mean, Hillerman, best-selling novelist. His novels were made into TV movies. He was, celebrated by the end of his life. And although Joe was met with great critical success early in his career, I mean, the critics across the board, whether it was the New York Times or the National Review, gave him a glowing review of one of his books. The critics knew what they had, but it never translated into the kind of mass readership that he really deserved, or that someone like Hillerman got. And I think that was a tough pill for him to take, because I think Joe was not a modest man. He knew how good he was, and rightly so. I mean, as we've all said, he was the consummate man of letters, and he was so dedicated to the literary life. And he knew how good his books were, and I think it was a source of disappointment to him that the general reading public pigeonholed them in the way that John's talking about, and that he never sold in the numbers he really should have sold, which also meant that he struggled financially through his entire life, which makes his acts of generosity, like teaching free, all the greater. I mean, Joe did not have an easy time with it.
I'll never forget once being over at Joe's house, and he told me that he had just received a royalty statement, and he looked at it, and it said $600, and he was expecting something closer to like 10 times that. I mean, that was the average. And somehow the sales had dropped, and it was, he said, I just feel like I've been punched in the stomach. And he managed to pull it together, and obviously he kept going as a professional writer. But even after he had made it and had several novels published, there were these roller coaster moments when suddenly the trampoline dropped out from underneath him when he was coming down for the bounce, and that too was a revelation to me. It wasn't like, well, you've made it as a writer, and now you just sort of keep doing the work and it will happen. I felt really there was nothing I could do for Joe except trying to keep putting out books that really were a small press book. I did a book of his short stories, for instance, that did pretty well as a small press. Well, I think we sold like maybe 1,500 copies, which is nothing in the marketing world. But I know Joe was really proud of these stories. If I'd like to read one of my favorite paragraphs of Joe's now, and it's a story that I reprinted in this collection, The Dog and Other Stories, and it's describing an accident that occurs about 2/3 of the way in the story. In front of him loomed a battered pickup truck, not a light showing, no one inside it. Its front wheels were mired in the shoulder gumbo. Its sharp shovel-shaped back end reared half across the black top. He tramped the brake pedal, geared down, wrenched the wheel. No good. Not at this speed. Not in the rain. The stalled pickup rushed at him. No, he thought. This can't be happening to me. Then he thought, Robbie. than he no longer thought. And if you can show me a paragraph you've written, I want to say to young writers, that's as good as that, then you're ready. You're on your way. You don't need me to teach you anything. But in fact, that kind of like paragraph with that single sentence paragraph, then he no longer thought, to describe someone dying, right, is frankly, I think it's genius. And
Yeah.
I've never ceased to think about that as an example of what I think I wish more writers aspired to. It's
That paragraph, it reminds me of one of his great strengths, which are his verbs.
mm,
You know, and just his voice is always active, but he says things geared down. You know, what a great phrase.
yes, yeah,
There's a story. I think it's in there's a collection of Brandstetter and others. So
yes,
there's a story of an old man climbing up on his roof in a storm to patch the roof, which is leaking. And it has that same cadence and kind of verbal intensity. And I can see it, you know, and it's all because of the verbs and the precision with which he first pictures the scene in his head and then manages to find precisely the right words to convey the picture to the reader, but in a way that doesn't call attention to itself. You know,
yes, yes, Michael. You know, when I read Shoulder Gumbo, I thought Shaggy Pond. That's that it's brushwork. It's the way he handles the language. He's like a painter. He's a musician, yes, but he's also a painter. And the way his brushwork is so subtle and yet effective at the same time in images.
That also extends to his dialogue. I mean, he's a brilliant writer of dialogue, and his characters are quite distinct in the way they talk, and he's very funny. He can be very funny, and I'm thinking now of passages in one of his books in which Brandstetter encounters. I think it was The Man Everyone Was Afraid Of was the novel, which takes place, I think, in a town he doesn't identify, but I think it might be Santa Barbara. I'm not sure. I should have asked him. Yeah, he would have these great California suburban towns, but he wouldn't identify them. And
Yes.
the city was at. But Branson is having this conversation with this man who was part of the homophile movement in the 50s, who's deploring kind of the flamboyant gay activists. And at one point, he tells Brandstetter, oh God, what's the line? Brandstetter says, well, did you tell your father? And he says, yes, the celebrations went on for days. And it's just like, that's great. You know, that tells you everything you need to know. And so he was a master of that kind of dialogue.
You could tell too in his classes, because while he was writing Steps Going Down and The Little Dog Laughed, he would read us chapters almost every week. And having Joe read Joe, you realize how much of a performer he was, brilliant, and how much the sound of words really worked there too, and how much of a poet he was.
Speaking of being a poet, and that aspect that he was very funny, one of the things that caught our attention as young poets right away was a sequence of poems he wrote. And I'll just read the titles to give you an idea of them. One of them was God is Having Trouble with His Teeth. And then there was a whole sequence of poems about the moon, the inhabitants of the moon. My mother does not like it on the moon. My father does not like it on the moon. My family gets together on the moon. Everybody on the moon will say hello. these are all these sort of the sequence of poems that Joe would read often at readings, poetry readings, and they have this combination of, I want to say, humor, but also kind of a blunt assessment of the human condition, in a metaphorical manner, that immediately engaged the audience. I don't think I've never grown tired of just reading those poems to myself and sort of hearing Joe's voice read them to me as I hear the words echo in my own mind.
Yeah, as I recall, he had a radio program for a number of years in the 60s, and he really had the perfect radio voice. It was kind of deep and mellifluous. And when he did read, because I did a couple of readings with him, he took that as seriously as he took everything else. I mean, I've been to readings where writers read their work as if they're reading their grocery list, and it's really tedious. You can't wait for them and to get through it. But Joe was an actor; he was a performer, and that actually inspired me when I do my own readings to think about performing the works and not just reading the words on the page. He was just a man of many, many sides, right?
Yeah, well, I believe he was also a songwriter, though. That's one side of him that I never did get a chance to learn much about or hear any tapes. But I gathered that when he was on KPFK, sometimes he would actually perform songs that he wrote. So if anyone can dig up those kinds of tapes, I certainly would like that. By the way, for anyone if anyone out there is thinking, well, what about doing some scholarship on Joe? Actually, his papers have been cataloged and are available at the Huntington Library.
Oh, great.
And to that extent, I think it's important to sort of just mention this. After all, the Huntington Library is not all potatoes. It's to have your papers there for scholars to look at is an extraordinary honor. And so, although it must be said, my memory is that they were kind of slow in getting the papers finally. I think Joe died before the papers were actually formally kind of organized. But I know they did get organized eventually, and I've looked at them, and there is probably about 150-page book of poems waiting there for somebody to put together. This is just a little 50-page book of poems that 1 foot in the boat, but Joe has about at least 150 pages of really extraordinary poetry that needs to be published.
He calls out
sitting there at the Huntington. I mean, I'm just saying it's there, all typed up. Yeah, go ahead.
He calls out for a biography. I mean, I really hope that some young scholar will take that task on and do it while those of us who knew him are still alive, so we can talk to them, because it was an extraordinary life. I mean, he didn't serve in World War II because when he was called up to serve, he told them, "I'm a homosexual," and they rejected him, which was really courageous. It's a courageous thing to do in the 1940s. His relationship with his wife, also really interesting, and how he navigated and explained his marriage. I asked him once, because Jane was a lesbian, Joe was gay, and I was an intrusive young fag, and so I said, "Why'd you marry her, Joe?" And he said, "Because I fell in love with her." And it wasn't a marriage in which they hid their sexuality. It was genuinely a love match, and she, in her own way, was an extraordinary woman, a teacher, and I think a great influence on him. And she supported him while he wrote. And I think her death was just a terrible, terrible blow to him.
Yeah, it's a matter. In fact, one of the poems that needs to be collected was published in a pretty well-known magazine, Zizival, which came out of San Francisco for years, and it's a long poem. It's and it's called "From the Dark, the Diary," and it's about Jane's final months, weeks, days on this earth. And it's one of the really great poems I've ever read in terms of being a tribute to another person with whom a person has spent his life. I highly recommend it. It's a syllabic poem, a form Joe was a master of. 7 syllables per line, 7 lines per stanza, 7 stanzas per part, and a 7-part poem. So it all folded out from line to stanza to part to the totality. From the dark, the diary. It's really one of the great poems of the last decade. Came out around 1995, I think. So and then of course Joe suffered from the earthquake. People forget that he lost his house.
Yeah.
On Cullen. It was totally obliterated. It was near Fairfax on the Santa Monica Freeway. And as everyone knows, that freeway collapsed in the Martin Luther Day earthquake, right? And back in the early 90s. But it wasn't just the freeway that collapsed. Actually, Joe's house became uninhabitable. It was condemned, and so he lost his house. So when people say, I want to say, imagine somebody, going through an enormous number of challenges. I think you really have to have the whole story, the whole context, and that's why he deserves a biography. It's something that where there's there's constant openings for new chapters.
Yeah.
Indeed.
I remember actually in the days after the earthquake, I drove down to see if I could get to his house on I guess it was Fairfax, not Fairfax. It was another street, but the freeway had collapsed and I couldn't.
It was on the 10 and the Fairfax, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, his house was destroyed, and he ended up living in Laguna Beach, I think.
Yes.
Which is
right.
An apartment, which was the last place where I saw him.
Right.
Those last years were tough, man. They were tough because he had never worked at a job other than writing. He didn't even have the safety net of Social Security.
Right.
It was a struggle. It was a real struggle.
Yeah.
While we're talking about his life, can we talk a little bit about him as an activist?
Yeah, so in the 60s, he began to write. Did you publish the book about his memoir at the end of his life? He wrote about, what's his name?
No, I didn't. I just published a book of short stories and a book of poems. So in the 60s, he became involved with, or maybe it was late 50s, a group called the Mattachine Society, which was the first homosexual activist group, and it started in the 50s. And he came, and like all of these groups, there were bitter internal divisions and lots of splits. And he ended up with one faction, and they published a magazine called, I think it was called Tangents. Yes.
That he wrote for. And that was a really big deal because it wasn't until the mid-50s that the Supreme Court made a ruling that magazines about homosexuality weren't per se obscene and pornographic. And Tangents was not pornographic. It was, it was advocating for the equal rights of homosexual men and women. And yet, until that decision, the U.S. mail wouldn't deliver it because it was considered the mere fact that it involved homosexuality rendered it obscene. So he told me once that he often wrote all the articles in the magazine using different names. Um, so I mean that was that was a very that was a very courageous thing to do. And although the magazine had limited circulation, it was still a necessary precursor to what would follow after Stonewall.
Right. I believe that Joe was one of the main or early organizers of the Gay Pride Parade. That's my understanding.
That wouldn't surprise me because he knew all the players who were involved in that. Morris Kite and I should know their names, but I don't. I've forgotten. I'm sorry, but yeah, he knew the whole group. And the original parades were organized in Hollywood. They went down Hollywood Boulevard.
Went down Hollywood Boulevard, correct.
And they were more in the nature of protests than parades, actually.
Yes.
I think, so the thing about Joe and homosexuality was that what we've said. So he is, although that may, just as Philip Roth's specific vantage point as a writer may have been his Jewishness, but his work speaks universally to Jews and to non-Jews. Joe's particular vantage point may have been in part his homosexuality, but it's not homosexual literature. It's work that speaks to the human condition. And I think he was very much conscious of that. And that was his goal. He didn't want to be pigeonholed as a gay writer because it's a very difficult path to walk and one I walked myself. On the other hand, this is our starting point, but this is not what we're writing about. We're writing about we're writing about a human experience that happens to incorporate this one aspect. So, so I think he had some issues with gay writers who were really just writing about, being gay in a way that he never did, because he saw himself in the broader stream of literature, not in some little tributary off to the side. So I think that accounts for why he didn't have, even among gay readers, the audience he should have had with those later books in the 80s. They thought he was kind of an old fuddy-duddy and a relic of the past. And it's his books that have survived, not necessarily the books that were being acclaimed at the time. And his books that will survive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's see. Do we have enough time to do a poem of his, a whole poem?
Yeah.
This is a poem that I remember him reading back in the early 70s. It dawned on me as we started the program that I believe next year will be the centenary of his birth.
Yes.
And I think that's worth mentioning in this program too. He was born in 1923, and here we're approaching 2023.
Mm-hmm.
This is a poem called Transfer. Today, when I didn't want to look at myself or talk to myself or listen to myself, I remembered how I used to ride streetcars all alone after midnight, noticing my reflection in the black window glass and thinking I was someone I would know someday, pick up a book, and there would be my name on the front, my picture on the back, the famous way I looked out of the corner of my eye in the black after midnight glass of the empty streetcar. The streetcars are scrapped now. Even the tracks have been dug up, and no one remembers for sure which streets they ran on. But today, when I didn't want to look at myself or talk to myself or listen to myself, I remembered that one night when I was riding back from nowhere on a streetcar to my sleeping wife and I hope sleeping baby, a boy with lashes like a girl's climbed on and came past all the empty seats to where I sat and sat by me and told me about his night school classes, opening books, pointing at parts of speech with a broken fingernail. And after bad drinks in a bar, where hags thought they were Francis Langford or Anne Sheridan, we finally got to his place, and on a bed in a room empty as a streetcar after midnight, on a mattress with no sheets, no blankets, nothing, skinny and naked and so young we were almost dead. We, as they say, made love. And today I pick up a book with my name on the cover, my picture on the back, pick it up and lay it down. I don't want to look at myself. Don't want to talk to myself. Don't want to listen.
Thank you, Joe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. And your books with your name on the cover and your picture on the back are going to endure.
So if there's anyone out there from UCLA listening, UCLA should organize a centenary celebration of Joseph Hansen next year. And it would be the right thing to do.
Yes, I think actually it's the perfect, well, thank you, Michael. This is the perfect way to end this program.
Sure.
And thank you, John, for maybe, sort of setting this in motion.
Well, if we can plant the seed for that centenary, that'd be great. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed remembering about Joe with you guys and finding out a lot of new things. And, I would just say about him is that I had just come out from Michigan and I hadn't really known any writers of any kind of stature. But you got the impression that people would be kind of a jerk if they were that level of artist. And to see somebody to be as kind and generous as he was and as talented as he was, that was a rare thing.
So I'll just close this. So Joe once told me that he consulted a psychic who told him he would be very famous posthumously. Let's hope this is the beginning of that prediction.
Yes.
Well, it's a fine trend. Yeah. Thank you so much, guys. This has been great. Maybe we'll celebrate the 100th.
I hope so.
Yes.
Thank you for inviting me, John. Nice to meet you, Bill.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you,
I can't tell you how much this meant to me. If nobody else listens, just for me to hear all this was beautiful. Thanks to the audience. Thanks to all our technical people. And we'll bid everyone a good afternoon.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.